Welcome back. We're going to continue on quickly here with part two of the Radical Reformation, the Anabaptists. And in this video, we're going to be looking at their history and something of the early developments of this particular part of the Reformation. So, the Radical Reformation, Anabaptists, part two. As you can see there, we're looking at the early history. The early history here is divided up into three basic movements, all basically related to the same set of doctrines and ideas, but in different geographical areas or three distinct regions. And so we'll be looking at Switzerland, the Netherlands, and in Germany. So the movement, as we've said, began in Zurich, Zwingli City, and the leader here was Conrad Grebel, who was an early disciple of Zwingli, as a matter of fact. They worked closely again at the very beginning. But at one meeting, Grebel rebaptized George Blurock, who in turn rebaptized a number of group of adults, and this is the beginning of the Anabaptist movement. As noted, these leaders were persecuted almost immediately. One of them, Felix Manz, was the first to die. He was thrown bound hand and foot into the Limnat River on January the 5th, 1527. So he is the first Protestant martyr to die at the hands of other Protestants because of his Anabaptist views. Grebel died in prison. He was imprisoned for his views. He died there probably of the plague. And Blaurock was scourged through the streets of Zurich before being banished. So then in the first 10 years of its history, more than 5,000 Anabaptists were executed in Switzerland alone. By 1535, the movement was all but extinct in Switzerland. Elsewhere, other Anabaptists managed to survive. The Schlichtheim Articles of 1527, edited by Michael Sattler, consolidated the Swiss Anabaptists. They brought them together under a set of doctrines or teachings, if you will. The goal of these articles was not the goal of this Anabaptism was not the purification of existing Christianity, as it was for the Zurich radicals, but rather the separation of congregations of believers from the world. So the Schlichtheim articles very quickly moved away from the notion of reform to just, again, sort of a radical idea, starting over again. Let's just begin again with something more pure. The Schlichtheim articles were the first to teach the idea of having a free church. The Swiss brethren came to be known for their legalistic approach to the Bible, apolitical pacifism, you've kind of seen that already, a salvation manifesting itself in the creation of separated congregations, and a baptism which symbolized that salvation and made the baptized a member of that congregation. The Anabaptist movement also happened in Germany. The Anabaptists in Germany were led by Balthasar Hubmaier, and Hubmaier had been a prominent Roman Catholic who converted to Protestantism and then held to Anabaptist views. He held some pretty distinct views. For instance, Hubmaier sided with Erasmus against Luther and with Augustine on the issue of free will, but he also sided with Zwingli and against Luther on the issue of the Lord's Supper. So he was kind of an individual that more or less went his own way on a number of things. One of the strange and frankly sad developments within the Anabaptist movement in Germany was, as it's labeled here, the strange case of the Kingdom of Munster. This was not a happy development. As this author says, the most damaging blemish on Anabaptist reputation came from an incident in Munster in Westphalia, up near the Dutch border in Germany. And that picture there is a stylized, idealized view of what they wanted to develop there in the city of Munster. As the persecution of the Anabaptists spread, their leaders looked for different places where they could find some refuge. In the 1530s, the city of Munster in Westphalia became such a place where Anabaptists could safely retreat. In 1534, some of these radical reformers took political control of the city. The radicals who came to Munster were led by two Dutch Anabaptists, Jan Matthias, I don't know how to say things in Dutch, and John Buckelzoon. It's probably not how you say either of those names, but you can read them. Better known as John of Leyden, who declared that the city of the New Jerusalem had introduced adult baptism in 1534. The radicals seized control of the city hall, appointed one of their own as mayor, expelled infidels, as what they called both Catholics and other Protestants, instituted a theocracy, that is a form of government in which God was to be the ruler, but basically it was all the Anabaptist leaders who spoke for God in that case, began to proclaim their own intention of conquering the whole world. They were going to actually, in essence, bring in the kingdom and bring in the millennial kingdom. Expected to do this, of course, with God's help, but they thought they were going to do it more or less in terms of a military takeover. The region's Prince Bishop, Frans de Waldeck, he was not happy. He was a Protestant sympathizer, at least, led siege to the rebellious city, and in April, on Easter Sunday, one of the radical leaders, Jan Matthias, prophesied that God would use him as an instrument of heavenly justice against the enemies of the New Jerusalem, and with a retinue of 30 men rode out against the besieging army, and he and his men were all promptly killed. Clearly not God's purpose to bring in the millennium through these fellows. The third major Anabaptist movement was planted in the Low Countries, that is the Netherlands, by Melchior Hoffman, who was zealously interested in eschatological speculation. Again, they all believed that the end was near, and they were going to help bring in the end of God's kingdom to the world, along with all of the other features of that development that the book of the Revelation speaks of, that is vengeance on the wicked and divine judgment. The righteous would participate in this judgment, not as the agents of vengeance, but as witnessing the coming peace. Hoffman's baptism served to gather the elect into an end-time congregation to build this new Jerusalem. But of course, that didn't happen, and he died after 10 years of imprisonment for his views in Strasbourg. Two lines carried on in a transformed vision fashion of the Hoffman legacy. One, the more revolutionary Melchiorites, who founded the short-lived kingdom of Munster, as we've just seen, led to a disaster. The city never became the New Jerusalem. In fact, it led to thousands of Anabaptists being killed. And following the fall of the city, the revolutionary element, Melchioritism, died out. The pacifist line, however, so in reaction to this more militaristic line, of Anabaptists, were the pacifist line of the Anabaptists, who were followers of Menno Simons. Menno Simons left the priesthood in 1536, and whose name in the 20th century is found in the Mennonites, the Mennonite denomination today. After the fall of Munster, Menno rallied the peaceful, now pacified Melchiorites, as well as the surviving Munsterites, who were now pretty much, and rightly so, disillusioned with the violence that had been caused. And Menno replaced Hoffman's near end time with the idea of a time of peace that had already begun. So he didn't teach that the end times had begun, but a time of peace in preparation for the end times had begun. So even some of those more radical end times views were sort of toned down. Menno developed concepts of the transformation of the individual and the assembly of a spotless church. They believed in something like perfectionism, although beginning from different presuppositions, Menno's positions on transformed individuals and a pure and separated church resemble closely the outlook of the aforementioned Schleckheim articles that we already mentioned. Under the leadership of Menno Simons, who left the Roman Catholic Church, as we said, in 1536, the excesses and fanaticism of the movement in Germany and Switzerland were avoided. They adopted the name Brethren, and there were several offshoots of that movement, and there are still some Brethren churches today, some of which still hold some of these views in modified form. Nevertheless, mostly after Simon's death, they became known as Mennonites. They continued to stress, in fact, they began to stress even more pacifism and separation of the church and state in the strictest sense possible. They were eventually granted freedom of religion in 1676, so they were persecuted for a number of decades between the 16th and 17th century. It wasn't just the rebaptizing, and this is the key point, and again, this is something I want to make sure you get. Part of the reason why they wanted to establish their city of Munster was because they were still under the impression that the church and state needed to be held together. After that, they recognized that the church and state needed to be separated. So the question has to be asked, why was there such a vehement and violent opposition to these Anabaptists? The answer is found in understanding Zwingli's medieval concept of the relationship between the church and the state. Zwingli had conceived of Zurich as a Christian state, a single unified Christian society in which church and state maintained a reciprocal relationship of trust and assistance. The visible church was coextensive with the local community. This was true of Luther and Calvin as well. It's what they inherited really from the Middle Ages, is they could hardly imagine the idea that the state or the government would have its own set of rules and its own sphere of influence, and that the church would be completely separated from that. They saw the state or the government as supporting everything that the church was trying to do. So in essence, that the state and the church would be seen virtually as one entity working together. The Anabaptists saw that this was a threat to the purpose of the church or the independence of the church, and therefore they taught that church and state needed to be separated. Well, the Anabaptists were in turn viewed as a threat to the stability of the social order, as well as being theological heretics. The whole tragic event in Munster seemed to prove the point of the Anabaptist view. We should not have the church and the state working together. The church should be independent of the state. This goes again with their doctrine of separation. The church needed to be, and believers needed to be separate from the world, separate from the church, and therefore separate from everything. And so they took that to a pretty strong point where they would not be involved in terms of the government, nor in terms of elections, nor in terms of the military, or in terms of even taking oaths in court, as we're going to see. Well, again, I'm going to stop this part of the video, even though you'll have to keep those notes that we've been looking at as we move on. But I want to keep these videos a little bit shorter for you, and so we will stop now and resume looking at these notes in the next video. So this is the end of part 2 of the Anabaptists, and we'll be beginning part 3 in a moment.